Follow the Brandywine Creek north out of Wilmington, Delaware, and the land drops fast, nearly 100 feet in 2 miles. The water dropped fast. The banks rose steep. The trees stood thick enough to swallow the sound of a blast before it reached town. This was geography suited to something dangerous. And in 1802, a French refugee with a French formula and French investors' money looked at that stretch of falling water and understood exactly what it was for. Not a metaphorical powder keg. An actual one, built stone by stone along a mile of creek bed, close enough to the family's own house that when the mills exploded, and they would, again and again, 288 times over the next 119 years. The family felt it too. On July 14, 1818, one explosion killed 34 workers, was felt 40 miles away, and injured the wife of the man who had chosen this stretch of creek in the first place. The water that made the fortune possible never stopped being able to take it back. It always could. Chapter 1. The Bowl and the River. Go back further than the powder mills, further than the Frenchman with the formula, back to 1638, when 2 small ships, the Kalmar Nickel and the Fogelgrip, worked their way up the Delaware River under the command of Peter Minuit, sailing for Sweden. They anchored at a rocky bluff on a lesser river the Lenape had used for generations, a river that joined a smaller, faster stream a short distance inland. Fewer than 25 colonists came ashore, carrying tools and trade goods and not much else. They built a fort of logs and named it for their queen, a teenager back in Stockholm who would never see the place that carried her name. Fort Christina, the first permanent European settlement in the entire Delaware Valley, and it survived on fur, beaver mostly, traded with the Lenape at the exact point where the Christina River met the Brandywine. New Sweden did not last. It was never large enough to defend itself, and by 1655 the Dutch had sailed up the river with enough men and guns to end the argument. Fort Christina surrendered without much of a fight. 9 years later, in 1664, the English took Delaware from the Dutch the same way the Dutch had taken it from the Swedes, by arriving with more force than the incumbents could answer. 2 changes of flag in less than a decade, and a third power's name imposed on a colony that had barely learned to answer to its second. The Swedish name stayed anyway. So did the settlement itself, which sat quietly through both transfers of power and became, over the following century, the core of a river town the English would eventually call Wilmington. Empires came and went. The bluff at the river's edge did not move. What mattered, in the end, was not who claimed the land, but what the land itself was doing. The Brandywine is a short river, barely 20 miles from its source to its mouth, and for most of that length it behaves the way a colonial-era river was supposed to behave: modest, navigable, unremarkable. Then, in its final few miles before it empties into the Christina and on into the Delaware, it changes character entirely. The banks narrow, the bed drops. Water that had moved at a walking pace for 18 miles suddenly moves fast enough to turn a wheel. And it keeps moving that fast, mill site after mill site, almost to the river's mouth. This was the accident of geology that Swedish colonists never exploited, and Dutch and English proprietors never fully understood. A bowl of hard, resistant rock that forced the Brandywine to fall instead of spread. And falling water, unlike land, unlike furs, unlike flags, could be sold by the horsepower. Sold again and again to whoever arrived next with a wheel and the money to hang it on the bank. By the first years of the 1800s, that stretch of fast water already had a working history, mill wheel after mill wheel strung along the same mile or two of bank. Flour mills stood there. A sawmill cut the lumber that fed a river town growing at the Brandywine's mouth, and looms turned raw cotton and wool into the plain cloth a young country needed by the yard. None of these operations belonged to a single owner, and none had been built with anything more dangerous in mind than grain dust and water weight. The Brandywine by Windrow and Branger, the Brandywine by 1800, was already doing what falling water does in a young industrial economy, turning wheels for whoever could afford to build one. It had been doing this in a modest way for the better part of a century, long before anyone thought to ask what else that current might be made to power. It was already, in other words, a working river when the stranger arrived to look at it in 1802. He was not the first person to see what the Brandywine could do. He was only the first to look at that same fast water and calculate with a chemist's precision exactly how much of it he would need to make something considerably more volatile than flour. Chapter 2. The Price of Bad Powder. Eleuthère Irénée DuPont did not arrive in America as a powder man. He arrived as a refugee, one of a family that had watched the machinery of the French Revolution consume the world they had known and had crossed an ocean rather than wait for it to consume them too. He carried no license to manufacture explosives, no apprenticeship in a French arsenal, nothing but a name, a network of investors still loyal to it, and an observation he had made on a hunting trip through the Pennsylvania countryside. The gunpowder sold to American sportsmen was expensive. And it was bad, not slightly bad. Consistently, expensively, indefensibly bad, in a country that would need enormous quantities of good powder if it intended to keep expanding. DuPont did the arithmetic an economist would have done. Then he did something an economist would not have. He went looking for the water to make his own. He found it on the Brandywine, on land he purchased on July 19, 1802, at a price of $36,000, raised from a syndicate of French backers, most of them fellow émigrés who had left similar estates behind and now held nothing more secure on either continent than the paper of a share certificate. The Brandywine offered what the venture required and nothing it did not: fast water, isolation from Wilmington's denser blocks, and enough vertical drop to run the machinery a powder mill needed without paying for steam. Construction started that same year. By 1803, the mills were producing powder for sale, not experimental batches, not samples, but product moving downriver to buyers who had, until then, no better option than the poor domestic powder or the expensive imported kind. The design of those first mill buildings tells you what DuPont understood that the flour men and the textile men working the same creek did not. He was not building a factory that might one day have an accident. He was building a factory that would have one repeatedly for as long as it operated, and the only open question was when. So the buildings went up small, and they went up scattered rather than clustered, and every choice followed from that single premise. Every building stood by itself. The walls between them ran thick with stone, and each one faced the creek, so that whatever a blast could not be stopped from doing, the water, and not a neighboring roof, and not a worker at the next wheel, would be left to absorb it. It was a design built entirely around a future event no one could schedule and no one seriously doubted would come. That design got its first serious American customer within a decade. The United States went to war with Britain in 1812, and DuPont powder went to the American forces fighting it. A domestic supplier proving contract by contract exactly the case Irénée had made with his own money back in 1802, that American powder no longer needed to come from anywhere else. 3 decades later, when American forces crossed into Mexico, DuPont powder went with them too. The same mills on the same mile of creek, still turning cotton rag and saltpeter and charcoal into a product the United States government now trusted enough to buy by the ton. 2 wars, 1 generation apart, and in both of them, the mills on the Brandywine stood as the same argument restated, this time in ammunition instead of in an investor's ledger. By 1834, the year Eleuthère Irénée DuPont died, those mills were producing more than 1 million pounds of powder a year on a stretch of creek that had held nothing more dangerous than a flour mill 3 decades before. The man who had once stood in a Pennsylvania field and priced out the cost of a bad batch of shot had built, within his own lifetime, the supplier the United States Army now depended on for 2 wars and counting. What he had not lived to see was how many times, over the century that followed, the walls he had built to contain an explosion would actually be tested. Chapter 3: The Ledger of the Dead. At a few minutes past 9 on the morning of July 14, 1818, one of the mixing houses above the Brandywine ignited without warning. The blast tore through the rolling mills below it, then rolled on up the valley and out across the Delaware countryside, breaking window panes in Wilmington and rattling doors on farms whose owners had never once visited the yards. It was felt 40 miles away. Inside the DuPont family home, close enough to hear the ordinary clatter of the machinery on any other day, the concussion arrived before most people even understood what had happened. The walls shook, the windows went from their frames, and Irene DuPont's own wife was injured where she stood, on what was supposed to be the safe side of the wall her husband had built. Not for the workers mixing the charge that morning. The men driving wagons past the yard gate had no more warning, and neither did the family inside its own front hall, 40 feet from the creek. The blast made no distinction. 34 men who had gone to work that morning did not go home. He had spent a career pricing the cost of a single bad batch of powder. On July 14, 1818, the mills sent him the bill at his own dinner table. He had 16 years left to live, all of them spent running the place that had sent it. That day was not an aberration. It was the largest single entry in a ledger that would run, by the time it finally closed, from 1802 to 1921. 288 separate explosions along 2 miles of creek. 228 dead. Men killed one at a time and in 2s and 3s across more than a century. An explosion at the works on average better than twice a year, every year, for 119 years. In blasts routine enough by the 1830s that the Wilmington papers didn't bother printing them unless the toll ran high. The specific cause shifted from incident to incident. The outcome rarely did. In 1890, 72 years after the first, a single explosion killed 12 more on the same water, in mills still carrying the same family name. The company grew. The creek kept its arrangement. Then, in April 1861, a war began that needed exactly what the Brandywine mills made faster than any customer ever had. The Confederacy fired on Fort Sumter, and the Union Army required gunpowder in volumes no American manufacturer had ever been asked to supply. DuPont, already the country's largest producer, became the Army's largest supplier for the duration, contracts arriving from the War Department year after year, through 1865, in numbers the company had not seen even during the last war with Britain. The mills that had killed 34 people in a single morning in 1818 spent 4 years running at a pace that made the family, for the first time, seriously rich. The transformation from a solvent regional manufacturer into a family with capital to spare happened inside those same 4 years, not across a generation. With the profits, they began buying land across the Wilmington area, farms, mill sites, water rights along the creek, estate after estate, acquired piece by piece over the years that followed. A second fortune, sitting on top of the first. The mills killed continuously. In wartime, the same mills made their owners rich. Both were true, on the same stretch of creek, under the same name, within the same half-century. Irene DuPont did not live to see either fact fully play out. He had been dead for 3 decades by the time the guns went quiet at Appomattox, and the business he had built now answered to men who had never met him, sons who had been children during the war years, nephews and in-laws barely born when the mills first exploded in 1802, a widening circle, running a company considerably larger than the one he had left. What none of them had settled, not by 1865 and not for decades after, was which of them actually owned it. The date on which that question stopped being deferred was still 37 years away. Chapter 4. What the Cousins Paid. Eugene DuPont, president of the company, died of pneumonia on January 28, 1902. The men who remained, uncles, in-laws, the surviving fragments of the older generation, did not see a company to be preserved. They saw a company to be liquidated, sold whole to whichever outside buyer would meet the price, the DuPont name folded quietly into someone else's balance sheet, the mills on the Brandywine answering to owners who had never set foot on that stretch of creek. A century of DuPont control over the works their founder had built was, in the first weeks of 1902, one signature away from ending. Within weeks of the funeral, the sale was no longer a rumor. It was a plan, and the plan had buyers waiting. 3 cousins stopped it. Thomas Coleman DuPont was the one who negotiated direct and unhurried, a man other men let lead a room without quite deciding to. Alfred the First DuPont was the one for whom the mills were not an asset to be priced but a place, and letting them pass to strangers was not a decision he was willing to make. Pierre S. DuPont was the quiet one, the one who read a balance sheet the way his cousins read a room, and it was Pierre's reading of the company's numbers that made the counteroffer possible at all. None of the 3 held senior rank in the company that spring. They were young men, cousins rather than heirs apparent, and the sellers, older, established, already halfway to a deal, had not thought to ask them first. They asked anyway. Instead of a liquidation, Coleman, Alfred, and Pierre offered a purchase, cousin buying from uncle, the business kept inside the family that had run it since 1802 rather than handed to strangers. The company was valued at $15.4 million. Almost none of that sum moved as cash. It moved as notes and stock, paper promising future value against a company whose future was, at that moment, precisely what was in dispute. If the takeover failed, the notes the 3 cousins had signed became worthless, and the men who signed them would answer personally for a company that no longer existed to pay them back. What the 3 cousins paid out of their own pockets, the part no note or share certificate could cover, the part that had to exist before any of the paper meant anything, came to $2,100 in legal fees split between them, roughly $700 each, not $700 apiece toward the company itself. $700 toward the lawyers who wrote the documents that moved $15 million from one set of DuPonts to another. A 100-year-old company changed hands that spring for less than a single mill worker earned in a year. The paper did the rest. Coleman became president, with Pierre installed as treasurer and Alfred as vice president. A family gunpowder partnership that had operated under the DuPont name since 1802 was reorganized within months into a modern industrial corporation. Audited, incorporated, financed on instruments its founders would not have recognized, governed by boards and bylaws where it had once been governed by kinship alone. The name on the letterhead did not change. Almost everything behind it did. Henry A. DuPont watched the buyout from a position the 3 cousins did not have. He was older, already established, and about to become something none of his relatives inside the powder mills had ever been. In 1906, 4 years after his younger relations secured the company, he took a seat in the United States Senate, representing Delaware, and he held it until 1917. He was the first of his generation of the family to sit in Washington. The mills had made the DuPonts rich for a century, powder and dynamite and cash moving quietly out of the Brandywine Valley into every corner of the family's ledgers. They had not, until Henry took his oath of office, made any of them a national office holder. The mills and the capital had, until then, belonged to separate branches of the same family. After 1906, they no longer did. That distinction did not last. Owning the company, it turned out, was only the first kind of ownership the family would pursue. Chapter 5: The Highway, the Schoolhouse, and the Senate Seat. By 1908, Coleman DuPont had a plan that had nothing to do with gunpowder. He proposed paving a modern highway the length of Delaware, from the Maryland line at the state's southern tip to Wilmington in the north. Not a company road, not a private drive. A public highway built with his own money, offered to a state that had never had one worth the name. In February 1911, he pledged $1 million of his own funds in advance, so construction could begin before the legislature had finished arguing about it. He did not stop at the pledge. Coleman formed his own road company and personally bought a 200-foot right-of-way running the length of the peninsula, farmland, crossroads, and town frontage, parcel by parcel, at his own expense. The project outgrew every estimate he had made for it. When the road was finished in 1924, it had cost him nearly $4 million, more than double his original figure. By 1934, the stretch between Wilmington and Dover became the first divided highway built in the United States. It carries traffic today under a plainer name, Route 13. His cousin Pierre was working a different ledger. In 1911, Pierre DuPont discovered that Delaware spent about $400 a year to educate a white child, and half that, $200, to educate a black one. He funded a survey through Columbia University's Bank Street Teachers College to put the state's school system under a light it had never faced. Then, he spent to fix what the survey found. Between 1920 and 1931, Pierre personally funded construction of more than 90 segregated schoolhouses for black students across Delaware at a cost exceeding $6 million, including more than $1 million for Howard High School in Wilmington, the state's only black secondary school until the 1950s. In today's dollars, Pierre's personal spending on Delaware's schools exceeds $90 million. The mills did not pause for either project. In 1915, an explosion at one of the DuPont powder works killed 30 men. The number was 30, not an estimate rounded for effect, but a count of the dead. And the company had spent 3 decades refining its safety record before that count was taken. New formulas, separated buildings, earthworks positioned so that one blast would not carry to the next. It happened anyway, in the same years that Coleman's crews were laying macadam toward Dover and Pierre's contractors were framing schoolhouses in Sussex County. The state got a highway. 90 new schools opened for black children across it. 30 families that same year buried their dead. All 3 ledgers were open at once, kept under the same name. Politics moved on its own schedule. Henry A. DuPont had given up his Senate seat in 1917, 4 years earlier. In 1921, a Delaware chancellor resigned, in a departure widely read at the time as a deal cut to clear a path to Washington. Thomas Coleman DuPont, the same Coleman who had built the road, was appointed to fill the vacant United States Senate seat. By the early 1920s, the family held a seat in the Senate. A highway running the length of the state, and a school system built at its own expense in more than 90 buildings between Wilmington and the Maryland line. Not one investment, 3, running at the same time, under one surname. Wilmington, Dover, the Maryland line. Sussex County, Washington. The family's money had now touched every one of them, in the same decade, from the same fortune. Delaware by then could be crossed in an afternoon on a road that had not existed 15 years before, past schoolhouses that had not existed 10 years before, into a capital where a DuPont now held a Senate seat vacant 8 months earlier. The name was on the highway, in the ledgers of the schools, and on the roll of the Senate. What it was not yet on not on a cornerstone, not on a plaque a passerby could read, was the family's own ground. While Coleman paved the state and Pierre built its classrooms, the DuPonts were also on their own land, building something no legislature had ordered and no survey had measured. Chapter 6. The Chateau, the Garden, the Marble Lobby. By the early 20th century, companies controlled by the DuPont family employed as much as 1 in 10 residents of the entire state of Delaware. The name no longer needed an introduction on a Wilmington payroll or a state ballot. What it had not yet claimed was ground that belonged to the family alone, and to no legislature, no shareholder, no board. And that changed first with Alfred I DuPont. He built a 77-room, 47,000 square foot French-style chateau above the Brandywine, called it Nemours, and finished it in 1910. Its grounds were laid out in the manner of Versailles. The largest French formal garden anywhere in North America, terraces and fountains and clipped hedgerows built for a family that 2 generations earlier had been mixing black powder in stone mills a few hundred yards downstream. Wilmington had watched Coleman pave its roads and Pierre fill its classrooms. Now it watched the family turn inward, building for no audience but itself. Where the roads and the classrooms put the name on things the public would use, Nemours put it on something the public could only see from the gate. Pierre DuPont built somewhere else entirely. He crossed the Pennsylvania line, bought a failing arboretum, and spent the following decades turning it into Longwood Gardens. 1,177 acres of fountains and conservatories, glass houses holding citrus and orchids through winters the trees outside could not survive. Grounds large enough that a visitor could walk them for a full day and still not see all of it. It was funded from the same family fortune that had paved Delaware's roads and built its rural schoolhouses, redirected now toward water in the air and flowers out of season. The company, meanwhile, built downtown. The Hotel DuPont rose on Market Street as a marble and crystal extension of the company's own corporate headquarters. A lobby of columns and chandeliers, a ballroom meant for the company's own functions, guest rooms for the company's own visiting officers, not a separate business so much as an announcement in stone that the company and the city's downtown now shared an address. Picture Market Street on a weekday afternoon in 1940. The DuPont building's tower rises above the sidewalk, and beside it, the canopy of the Hotel DuPont shades a line of cars idling at the curb. Streetcars run the length of the block, their bells cutting through the noise of the lunchtime crowd. Newsboys call headlines from the corner nearest the hotel's canopy. Store windows carry advertisements for a fabric the company had introduced that spring. Nylon, woven into stockings for the first time, sold 6 blocks from the laboratory that made it. Office clerks in the company's employee cross, at a corner where 2 generations before, wagons had hauled black powder toward the river mills. Delivery trucks idle where those wagons once rolled. A place that had been a gunpowder works on a creek 80 years earlier was now a city of 112,504 people. Its skyline and its civic life organized almost entirely around one company's headquarters and one family's name. That figure, 112,504, was Wilmington's high point. The city would never again be larger, and for that one stretched-out moment, its schools, its charities, its skyline, and its street directories all traced back through the same ledger to the same name: Chateau, Garden, Hotel, Headquarters. In the space of 3 decades, the family had built a private version of nearly everything the city already had in public, until the 2 versions were no longer easy to tell apart. No later chapter of the city's history would find it this large or this thoroughly organized around one surname. Beneath the marble and the gardens, though, the city had also drawn lines the family's giving never crossed. The schools Pierre funded so completely were, in practice, still separate by race, in neighborhoods that would soon be sorted by more than a school district line. That fact unlike the chandeliers on Market Street, would outlast the peak by decades. Chapter 7. The Maps Beneath the Marble. The gardens photographed well. So did the chandeliers, the marble lobby floors, and the schoolhouses with Pierre DuPont's name cut into their cornerstones. What the photographs did not show was the ink underneath them. In the 1930s, federal appraisers had drawn a second set of maps over the city, ringing its black neighborhoods in red and marking them unfit for mortgage lending, block by block, street by street. Banks read those maps for decades afterward, long after the appraisers who drew them had retired or died, and refused loans on their say-so alone, no questions asked twice. The schools Pierre had funded so completely, the same buildings still glowing under new wiring and fresh paint, were never merged with the schools built for white children a few blocks away. Two school systems built by one patron standing in one city. Wilmington kept the line he had never set out to draw. On April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was shot dead in Memphis. Wilmington held its memorial service 5 days later, on the evening of April 9th. Within hours, unrest broke out across the city's east side, in the same neighborhoods the redlining maps had circled a generation before. Governor Charles Terry called up the National Guard before midnight. By the morning of April 10th, 2,800 troops held the city. Patrol jeeps parked on residential corners, curfews checked door to door, a downtown built on chemical fortunes now walked by soldiers in fatigues instead of clerks. City officials described the deployment as temporary, a matter of weeks until order returned. It did not lift in a week, or a month, or the season. It ran 9 months into January of 1969, the longest National Guard deployment of any American city following King's assassination. No military occupation of a United States city, before or since, has lasted longer. The soldiers eventually went home. The infrastructure raised alongside them did not. Interstate 95 was routed through Wilmington's midsection in these same years, and the path the engineers chose ran straight through some of the city's most stable black and working-class blocks rather than around them. Row houses came down for the grade. Churches and corner groceries came down with them, parcel by parcel, and no hearing overturned the route once the crews and the surveying stakes arrived. The interstate did something else besides move traffic through the city. It gave the chemists and engineers filling the towers on Market Street a fast road to somewhere else entirely, away from the same blocks the Guard had patrolled a few years before. A man could spend his working hours inside the company's own laboratories and his evenings in a subdivision 15 miles beyond the city line his employer had helped pay to build. Within a generation, that had stopped being the exception. It was simply the arrangement, repeated house by house, family by family, until the commute itself was how the city's most valuable workers lived. The census kept its own record, counted off in round decades. Wilmington's population had crested at the end of the war and never risen again after. Through the 1950s, the city shed residents at a rate of 1.4% a year. That rate climbed to 1.74% a year through the 1960s. The decade of the memorial service, the fires, and the 9-month occupation, and kept falling into the 1970s unbroken, one decade folding into the next without a single year of recovery among them. The interstate ramps stood as the only new construction in neighborhoods that had lost their row houses to build them, and the schools once split by the color of a map now sat half empty on both sides of the old line. Neither side was growing, no one filing reports at Guard headquarters that winter, and no one signing a mortgage in the new subdivision strung along the interstate could yet say how much further the line had left to run, or which year would turn out to be the bottom. It had not found its floor by 1970. It would not find it by 1980 either. Wilmington still had one more decade of falling left to record before that question would finally be answered. Chapter 8. What the water left behind. The answer came in December of 2014, and it arrived as a magazine headline, Murder Town, USA. Newsweek ran the story about a city whose population had fallen under 71,000, a city most of its readers could not have located on a map. That year, Wilmington recorded 27 homicides. Among American cities of comparable size, only 2 posted a higher rate: Flint, Michigan, and Saginaw, Michigan, both hollowed out by the same kind of departure that had already emptied Wilmington's own mills and offices decades earlier. The magazine did not mention DuPont by name anywhere in the piece. It did not need to. The city on the cover was the one the company had left standing when it stopped needing it. The company itself was still coming apart. In 2015, DuPont spun off Chemours, taking with it the heaviest chemical liabilities and the least of the old prestige, into a separate corporation of its own. A year later came the merger with Dow Chemical, a deal announced, completed, and reversed almost in the same breath, since the combined company survived only long enough to be split again in 2017 into 3 separate firms, each smaller than the whole that had preceded it. 1,700 Delaware employees were laid off in the first wave alone. Other rounds followed in the years after, quietly, without headlines of their own. The tide that had carried workers through the gates for more than a century had turned around, and there was no ceremony for the turning, no plaque, no name for it at all. Today, the old Wilmington headquarters site employs close to 1,100 people. Set that number against the payroll the company once carried, when something close to 1 job in every 10 across the entire state of Delaware traced back to a single company and a single family. The ratio did not erode gradually, the way these things are supposed to. It broke. What grew in its place was not another factory. Delaware rebuilt its economy on paper instead of powder, on the Court of Chancery, the oldest business court in the country, and on more than 2 million business entities now chartered within the state's borders, a figure larger than the number of people who actually live inside them. Corporations choose Delaware today the way the DuPonts once chose the Brandywine, for what the ground offers, not for what stands on it. Most of those 2 million entities keep no office here. Most send no employee, rent no building, walk no hallway. The filing itself is the entire relationship. The city's population, as of the most recent count, stands at 71,675. That is down by more than a third from the peak it reached in 1940, when the mills and the war years together pulled in more residents than Wilmington has held at any point since. Some of what the family built is still standing, though not for the purpose it was built for. Nemours, the 77-room chateau at the edge of town, sells tickets now instead of hosting dinners. Longwood Gardens, just across the state line, draws more than 1 million visitors a year to grounds first planted by a man who made his fortune from explosives. The Hotel DuPont still pours coffee beneath the same chandeliers that were hung when the company's name and the city's address were the same thing. The family that once decided who was hired and who was let go survives now mostly as lettering, on a children's hospital, on a green highway sign, on the ticket booth of a garden. The Brandywine still drops out of Wilmington the way it always has, falling close to 100 feet across the same 2 miles of ground. The banks are steep still. The trees have grown back thick enough, in places, to hide the water again the way they once hid the sound of a blast before it reached town. But no wheel turns where the mills stood. And no current is asked anymore to power anything at all. It is only a creek now, running downhill toward a bay that has stopped waiting on it. The water never changed. Everything that once needed it did.